Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gill Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gill@eapen.info. My guest today is Professor Krishnanand Maillacheruvu, who is a professor of civil engineering and construction at Bradley University. His teaching interests include various areas of civil and environmental engineering, sustainability, ethics, and public policy. In addition to more than 50 publications in international journals and conferences, Krishna has co-authored 3 book chapters in the field of environmental engineering. Welcome, Krishna.
Thank you, Gil. It's great to be here. And it's also wonderful to touch base with you after such a long time.
Yes.
Very happy to be on this program.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to start with one of your papers. It's entitled Rejuvenation of Rivers and Lakes in India, Balancing Social Priorities with Technological Possibilities, in which you say, in the light of shortage of water in several parts of the world, especially in the developing country like India, and in the context of prevailing policy of accelerating growth through industrialization, there is an imminent need for devising newer approaches of water management. You want to talk a bit about that paper?
Yeah, sure. The context of this paper was that I took a sabbatical that year, 2011, and I spent that with one of my colleagues who also did his PhD at the same time with me.
Yeah.
His name is Shyama Sulaikar. So we did this project. So the sabbatical was in IIT Bombay.
Right.
And essentially what happened there was, when I got there, we were working on a number of different projects and things like that. But this started to be one of the emerging things. And Shyam has been working on similar related type of topics for a while. But we felt like that was a time that there was something called the Ganga Action Plan in India, and that was also going into a new stage. And there was also something called the Yamuna Action Plan, and there was some concern about how the management practices were happening there, and how there was a technology gap, and then there was also a difference in terms of how it was being applied in different parts of the country at that time. So we said, why don't we look at the whole thing and not just look at it just purely from a water distribution standpoint or a water availability, but just look at the whole thing? Because let's face it, in our world, we live in a connected world. Like, I don't live apart from somebody else or separate from somebody else. I'm connected with other human beings.
Yeah.
And what happens around the environment affects me, and as I affect the environment, both from a complete sustainability standpoint, in the sense that not only the environment, but the economics also plays a big role into it. And then you cannot neglect the social side of it, because if you do that, that's again to the detriment of any solution that you might be producing there. So that was the context of this of the paper, and then we were invited by Elsevier to write this paper. And initially we had started out and we started to look at the data. We looked at the data from different parts of India. And then slowly it actually grew into, we also looked at other parts of the world too. And it was a stunning thing. What we found was that out of all of the naturally occurring water resources that we got data on, there was not even one of them what we could call pristine, or something which was free of any pollutants. Right. And that was even though we suspected this, but just to find that out was something of a eye opener. And then we said, how do we connect this? I mean, so
these samples, Krishna, one quick thing. So these samples are coming from any water body or just rivers?
No, from different. So some of them are from rivers. So again, this is not just the data that we collected. This is data that is coming from, India has something called the CPCB, which is called which is the equivalent of EPA, US EPA here. And so they manage all of those data resources. So we got a lot of data from them, and we got a lot of data from other parts of the country too, and the world. But they came from rivers. They came from lakes and also from groundwater. So I mean, those are the three primary sources where we draw water from.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. And so did you have any sort of time-based data to look at how water quality has changed over time?
Yeah, we did have we do have that, and the historical data goes back, at least a couple of decades, even more than that in some places.
Yeah.
But when you look at data sets like this, you have to also appreciate the fact that people are not collecting the data in the same way. So there's going to be differences in how they collect the data, etc. But despite that, we saw these trends about, and typically we would say we have two or three, if I just give you maybe parameters, which commonly anybody can relate to. One is called the BOD, or what's called biochemical oxygen demand. And that's really a measure of how polluted a river or any water resources is in terms of the organic material.
Yeah.
So the more the organic material in general, or in more the waste are there, the higher the BOD generally. Mm-hmm. And there's another measure called COD, chemical oxygen demand, and it measures a similar thing, except it goes beyond what is biologically biodegradable, and it also looks at possibly other types of sources, such as industrial pollution sources and such. So the waste which was coming into these different areas was not just human waste, but it was also coming from other types of things. So that's one.
Yeah.
The BOD and COD, I can say, put together as one. Then you can think about things like the microbiological quality, which is more of the water side, or the safety in terms of the drinking. Mm-hmm. So again, that's a very significant thing. So we had data on that also from different parts of the from different sources, and so we kind of looked at all of that in a more complete sense. And even more important is that what we also found, that when we dug deep into some of these case studies, and we found actually they were not case studies at the time, they were just information pieces in different places. We actually discovered how the process of the waste was actually, how the waste was contaminating these water resources. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, some of that could be managed effectively. I mean, it was as simple as managing things properly. In some cases, of course, the technology was needed. But the availability of safe, clean drinking water was really a big, big issue. And that is really probably the fundamental reason why there is so much disease and so many problems, and not just in India, but in much of the world, where we are looking at the rate of development being so fast, but then we don't have the infrastructure to catch up with it.
Yeah, so these natural water sources, Krishna, they are not potable water, right? You have to treat them before you can use it, right?
No, no. We were looking actually at the. We've looked at both of them. So, for example, when you look at lakes and rivers or groundwater, those are definitely potable water.
Okay.
So these are drinking water supplies that people actually use. But what we found was that, and I think it's now very well documented everywhere else, is that when you have a chain of, for example, if you take a river or a stream, let's take a river, and you have so many villages and so many towns, and if they grow if they're small enough, the waste is manageable. But then if the waste is very high, which means the population is high or the industries are there, they discharge all this water sequentially. So what happens is that, suppose I live downstream from from another big town or big village or big city, and then somebody else lives downstream of me. The person who's downstream of me gets the effect of the BOD and the POD, the COD and the other pollution that's coming from the first source, second source, and third source. So as a result, it all adds up. And the cumulative, effect is it's actually a synergy in the wrong way, and so essentially it just and in some places it just kills the river, which means that the oxygen levels actually fall to zero, which literally kill the river. There's no fish, nothing. Okay, so that's one of the problems there, and the people who live downstream, they don't have any other water supply. They still use that same water, and the shocking thing is that they don't even have basic water treatment type of technologies with which they can purify that. So essentially they're drinking the waste that has been generated by somebody else. I mean, in a very raw sense, but then you're looking at it over a stretch of maybe 20, 30, 50, 100 miles.
Right. Yeah. So, one of the things you focused on the paper is balancing societal priorities with available technologies. I don't know exactly if you discussed this in the paper, but from an economic perspective, Krishna, this is sort of upstream users. It sounds to me that they're externalizing costs. So there has to be some sort of an economic transfer from upstream users to downstream users from a policy perspective, right? I don't know how it works.
No, I think when you use that word externalizing the cost, that is you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what is happening. In fact, it's not just happening in the water sector in India, but it's also happening in the solid waste. Very recently, last year also, I went and I did another sabbatical. This time it was at both Bombay and NIT Madras, and we had similar type of thing, but except we were focusing more on the solid waste problem. But the externalization of the cost, especially in the sense of that water example that we are discussing, is very critical because if you look in most of the homes, even they say, well, my home is very clean, and you go inside, it's maybe a small hut, it's my small whatever it is, it's very clean inside. But then just where did the waste go? They just went outside. So it's right out there. Now, what happens is that if the waste is not managed properly, what they're doing is that and if the population size is high enough, even the municipal waste itself could wash away because of rains, etc., and then drain into these rivers and lakes. So that causes the problem. So certainly they're externalizing the cost. So then you say, well, how do you actually deal with this type of a problem, right? So my friend Shyam Solekar, who's been doing this work also for a long time, he's done a fair amount of good work in this in India. Some of the work that it's like this, that you cannot have that social prioritization and balance the economic, all of that stuff. You can't do that unless you actually address the problem on the ground in that village, etc. So, for example, let us say that some waste is being generated. So if the waste is allowed to go directly into the stream, it's a waste that has been externalized, but it also causes a problem, health problem, and that has its own societal effects, and it also has its own economic effects because obviously healthcare costs and various things like that. But now, if you are able to manage that waste within that village or within that sector, one of the things that happens is, how do you do that is the next question. If you do that, then you're ahead of the game. So how do you do that? So there's some examples of that in this paper. So one example is, when the water comes out, the wastewater comes out, instead of just pushing it away into something, into a lake or or a river, you take that and then, for example, you can create a small pond. And this is where the technology comes in. Now, remember that when we talk about the technology, there's a phrase I'm going to use called appropriate technologies.
Right, yeah.
This appropriate technology is a very critical phrase, because we cannot use a highly mechanized technology in a place which doesn't have the infrastructure to support it.
You need power too.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I mean, some of the projects that I've seen when I was in India and also outside, is that a lot of the funding that goes to these projects, people are always, IMF and other agencies, etc. They pump this money into these areas, but then one of the things that happens is that the people who buy these technologies, they buy it with the hope that it'll actually last for a long time, but it cannot, because there's no parts to replace it. The manpower to run it is not there. So the appropriate technology means necessarily that the technology has to be low cost in a place like that. And by the way, it's not just local to, or it's not just native to India or other developing countries. We can use that in highly developed countries, including the United States, especially in the rural areas where you're dealing with similar types of economic issues. So here, when you create with these for example, oxidation ponds followed by trickling filters, etc., and these are some of the case studies, and the input in terms of the power input, in terms of the pumping, all of that, those costs are very, very minimal. So most of it, the flows by gravity. So the nature will take care of it. I mean, one of the biggest friends for us is the nature. Now, if we overpollute something, you overwhelm nature. That's something we don't want. But if you give enough time, you can actually convert that the waste into, it gets converted into CO2, etc. But then what flows out is essentially effluent, which is not so bad. And then you can run it through some kind of a sand filter, which is, again, very cheap technology. And then once you do that, then you can actually put it into a pond. And that pond is treated wastewater, which is very good. In fact, a lot of times that treated wastewater is as good of a quality as you might find in many rivers and streams. And in that pond, for example, in some of these case studies that you might see, people can use that for growing fish, other types of thing. So it can actually serve as a place where they can grow these things, and then they can either utilize that or they can sell it off. So the stigma of using the wastewater is gone, because you have cleaned the wastewater now. So therefore, you're dealing with water. Now, even after that, the next step, because you have a continuous supply, so that water which comes out then can actually be used for farming, instead of just throwing it away, or letting it go into the ground without being treated. So so all along this chain, what you've done is use the appropriate technologies, and which means that the people on the ground have the manpower is there, and they have the know-how to run this, because it's not so complicated, and it's not so mechanized. That's one very important thing. The other thing is that you're buying you're having a buy-in from the community, in the sense that you're creating a resource for them. And one of the resources, one is the water, clean water that comes out. And the second thing is things like these fish ponds and such, which can actually generate revenue for them. So you're really doing that. And wherever those types of operations have happened, and this necessarily has to be decentralized or in a small scale. So what was being externalized as a problem, now if you manage it in a proper way, you actually create a resource out of it, and it becomes beneficial to them. So as long as there is buy-in from the people, then you actually have a very productive process by which you convert something which was a waste into a very useful resource.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So when you say decentralized and small scale, one thing I was wondering was that if it is kind of self-sufficient and autonomous, perhaps use solar power, doesn't require, a lot of external manual feedbacks to it. You can, and if it is distributed and small scale, you could probably go to places all around the river and have these types of units. I'm just speculating.
Oh, yeah, no, it's a fantastic idea. And it has to be managed and designed and delivered properly, also executed properly, because anything of this type requires a certain vision and then also skillful execution. Those are the two things that kind of go together with a project like this. But if you look at a country like India, solar power is there, right? I mean, this is a place where you find a lot of sun, and not only when you talk about India, but also other places on the planet which enjoy that type of a climate. And so therefore, it makes perfect sense to use them as power sources. For example, if you have to run pumps or if you have to run other kinds of, and they may not be very high powered pumps. I mean, these may be low, in terms of the input of power that's needed, they may be lower. So you can certainly do that. And that's a very effective way of doing this. These are the kinds of, I would say that would be an example of an appropriate technology, which can be integrated into this waste management system.
Yeah. You touched on this already. Another paper that's related, entitled "Reusing Fractions of Legacy Municipal Solid Waste in India: A Circular Economy Approach." So these are legacy waste or aged waste. And then basically, again, the issue is the same, right? The sites are often on locations where fresh waters are not brought because the sites are fully packed and inoperable, you say. So the problem appears to be very similar.
Yeah. So this work actually goes back to maybe 2015-16. And then I think this paper is probably just came out. And this was also work that I did with my colleagues in India. And one of the projects that they were doing at the time was with actual landfills in India. There are a few landfills. I mean, this came out at the time. There was suddenly an urgency in 2016 when one of the landfills in Mumbai, I think the Deonar one, it caught fire, and you could see it in some of the NASA pictures. I mean, you could see it.
Yeah.
But there was similarly the issue. Then the problem said then the people got awoke to this issue, and they said, "Well, let's take a look at a few others around the country."
Yeah.
But then when you look at it, you have so many hazardous waste landfills. This was an amazing thing. These are designed landfills, but there's no municipal waste landfills as such. I mean, at that time. It's changing slowly in India. But then the question becomes, when you have these dumps, and these are very common. In fact, I remember some of them when I was growing up, even in Chennai. If you go to certain parts of the country or the city, you would see these dumps. And they grow and they grow and they grow. And, they just, it's first of all, it's an eyesore. The second thing is, bigger problem is it's a health hazard. And then the third thing is that, you can actually have a lot of pollution that comes off of it without, when people really don't think about. For example, you could have runoff, you could have the air pollution part of it, even without something burning. So you have many other issues also. And not only that, economically, it will bring down the price of the neighborhood, etc. So those are all the issues there. So how do you deal with a problem like that? So this was a very interesting approach. And we did some work here in this country, and also there was a paper in Chicago, also an ASC paper on that. But then we also came and visited the landfills around this area to get a good handle on what are the best solutions to this. So one way to deal with this type of a solid waste problem is to see if you can go to a zero net production. So in other words, what you're doing is that if you have and with legacy wastes, that term itself was coined by us, by Sham a while ago, just very recently.
Yeah.
But then the thing is that these legacy wastes, these are the old waste, and they've been aged, and so they have some properties like that. So can you actually take that and make it go away, essentially?
Right.
So and so then the question, how do you make it go away? The only way you can make this go away is by doing close to 100% recycling. So that was the objective. So then the question becomes, how do you separate the different fractions? And there's a proper way to do that. Not only that, the scale of the operation is important too. So suppose you're talking about small cities, small villages, bigger cities, medium-sized cities, etc. I'm talking about in the Indian context. You will find different sizes of these landfill operations. And so the type of the recycling operations and the type of reuse is going to be quite different. So, in that paper, there are several references to the various fractions in which you can convert them. And then we said, well, there's also this issue of this plastic waste. And at that time last year, the whole issue of this plastic, the regulation on plastic, the policy on plastics was evolving in India. And I didn't go there thinking I'll get involved with something like that, but I did get involved with that. And we had these different conferences and workshops in different places and meetings with different government officials too.
Yeah.
And that policy is still evolving. It's getting close to it. But the idea is that how do you not use plastic? I mean, you can't just tell people don't use plastic and not give them an alternative. So you have to do something with that. Right. But in the context of legacy wastes, there are things that, for example, don't degrade, don't biodegrade. And these might be plastics, other types of materials too. So in that case, after you exhaust all the resource, all the ways in which you deal with it, one of the ways you can one thing you can do is to incinerate them. Incineration is really the very last option that I would consider. But the objective there is to produce some energy out of it. So, that would be something like that. So after you take out everything else, that would be the way. So legacy wastes are a huge problem in India. And they're starting to tackle it in different places. I actually visited some of those landfills last year as well. The objective again is to remove all the legacy waste so that you create a site, and part of that site can actually be used to design an engineered landfill of some type. And once you do that, then you're okay. In 2011, when I was there, we gave a series of workshops to the pollution control boards, the state pollution control boards. We had groups of officers and engineers come from different places. These are policymakers on hazardous waste management. And during that, my interaction with them, I learned that at that time they were looking more in the hazardous waste, but they were really not even looking at the municipal waste problem. And that has changed since then. The last time I went, they're slowly looking at that a little bit more in terms of having engineered landfills, because that's the only way to do it. Landfills are really something that I won't recommend as a first thing, but those are things that we have to deal with and eventually, because you will necessarily produce something, because that's the nature of how thermodynamics works. Anyway.
Yeah, so some of the sites, as you say, is fully packed, so you can't really use them anymore. But when you recycle, put in some process for recycling, are there ways to get energy from it? Are there technologies that could be put into use?
Yeah, there are a lot of tech. See, one thing you can, from a thermodynamic standpoint, the less you burn or the less you convert something into something which is more oxidized, the better off you are, because it's already in a higher energy state. So if we can do the recycling, first of all, the source reduction, if we can cut down the waste production, that would be great. Now, that's not such a big problem in India, but the population is high and the magnitude of things is high. So for example, in the case of the legacy waste, if you are able to take some of that material and then directly recycle the organic fraction and make compost out of it, now you have produced something which is of value. And then you take some of the solid waste, and then for example, you may have construction and demolition debris, which is really a really horrible waste of space in any place, including in a landfill. So if you're able to take that and then try to make something out of it and use it on a construction site, that's one thing. There are many materials which you can actually do a little bit of processing and make, say, different bricks with it. And so those bricks and those types of building materials, they may not have the same strength as, say, concrete or something like that. But at the same time, you can use them for certain applications. So such as, maybe retaining walls or, some kind of operation. So that would be the preferred way. But then ultimately, if you're left with something that you can't do anything with, then those are the ones that you may have to incinerate. And even though incineration is considered to be a bad word, as an engineer, you really can't rule out all the possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Another area, I just want to shift gears. Another area that you've been working on is the removal of nutrients from wastewater.
Right.
And when you have a lot of nutrients in the wastewater, I guess there are issues like algae and plant growth and dissolved oxygen issues. So these are things like phosphorus and nitrogen.
Exactly. Those are the two big ones. Yeah. That's pretty much it. Yeah.
So how do you, there are chemical ways to remove them, biological ways to remove them. So what is the state of the art for something like that?
Yeah, I work with one of our local wastewater treatment plants very closely. Most of my work is quite practical or, applied. So a few years ago, I had a student who was working with them as an intern, and there are different ways, like you said. Before I go into those details, there are, like you said, there are chemical precipitation methods. Those are quick, but those are a little bit more expensive, and then you have to deal with the waste one way or the other. Sometimes that may be the best option. So you can't rule out any option. But if you use the biological approach, which is used by a lot of people and actually pushed a lot by people, and my background also is biological treatment, so I have to acknowledge that bias. But at the same time, one of the things that you can certainly use biological means, and you can change the type of microorganisms that you have in the wastewater treatment plant through a mix of different different strategies by changing different conditions, how much oxygen there is, etc. So the local wastewater treatment plant here, that's called the Greater Peoria Sanitary District. It's one of the more I would say a progressive type of wastewater treatment plants, and going back to the 1950s and 60s when they came up with a new process called the krausening process. That was the first time that anybody was dealing with issues of nitrogen, etc. But then more recently, just in the last maybe 3-4 years, they've put in a process called enhanced biological phosphorus removal. And I've seen this process right from the beginning to the end in terms of the construction of what they did, what changes they made. So, the principle simply is that, so if you control the phosphorus and if you control the nitrogen, then what will happen is that when the discharge happens, the discharge will actually into the rivers. The rivers are not going to be laden with these chemicals, and then eventually, if you live in this part of the country, in the Midwest, for example, Illinois River runs through Peoria, so the Illinois River drains into the Mississippi River, and so do so many other rivers. And the Mississippi is pretty big. Eventually, it drains into the Gulf of Mexico. And you look at the Gulf of Mexico, you have a dead zone, and that dead zone is mainly because of the nitrogen and phosphorus, excessive growth of algae, like you said. But then when they die off is when the problem begins, because then it becomes BOD, sucks out all the oxygen, and then it wipes out the economics of the economy, because now the fishermen don't get their food, etc. Or the place to or their crop of fish to sell, etc. So it destroys the commerce in that sense. Not to mention all the beaches, etc. So if you control the problem at the source, which means at least you're dealing with it in the wastewater treatment plants, you're controlling part of the problem. The bigger problem, which is more difficult to deal with nitrogen and phosphorus, is really the farmland, and there's no easy way to do that. So the only way to do that is by things like what they call phytoremediation, using plants and using buffer strips along the way to kind of remove those types of chemicals. Because they are very effective. Plants are very effective, and that's what they do. By the time, but it's not being practiced uniformly in all the states in this country. And you can understand that the farmers who are dealing with that, they want to maximize their crop, and so they may do farming till the edge of the river, which is really not a good idea. So it's a process of education, and it's been happening for some time now. There's some states are more advanced than others in terms of how they've implemented that solution. But
the biological processes, are they using some sort of microorganisms for that, or how does it work?
Yeah, biological processes, we can say, if you talk to anybody in the field, biological processes typically refers to microorganisms, like typically bacteria is really what they're talking about. But biological processes can also include plants. In that case, it would be called phytoremediation.
I see.
Phyto meaning the PHYTO stands for plants. So in a broader sense, you can include both of them.
Okay. Yeah, another area that you have a lot of interest in been doing work in is the mathematical modeling of environmental systems. And this is, looks like a very complex problem. There are a lot of decision makers, a lot of different planners, and a lot of different issues to consider, right? Social, economic, technical, legislational, institutional, and political issues. So when you model these things, I'm coming from the corporate world where decisions need to consider a lot of uncertainty around all types of factors. How do you consider uncertainty around policy choices when you think about these things?
Yeah, most of my modeling work, especially with environmental systems, has been on the science side.
Okay.
But there's a huge amount of uncertainty. And because if you look at it in terms of how much, suppose I have to look at the rate, 5 different rates and 10 different processes, there ends up being so many different simultaneous differential equations you have to solve and all that kind of good stuff. And then not only that, each of those equations is now, some of them are stiff equations because of the rates and all that kind of stuff. And then there is the issue of actually the uncertainty within each of those parameters. How accurate is the stuff? So then, as engineers, we typically talk about things like safety factors.
Right.
We say, okay, we'll apply a safety factor so to account for all these uncertainties. But then the problem of uncertainty still remains. And unless somebody does a proper sensitivity analysis and uncertainty analysis on that, you won't know what safety factor to apply. We have a general idea about that. When it comes to policy making, that's part of also some of the classes I teach. Modeling policy is inherently much more complex because there you're dealing with people, and there you're also dealing with policies. And there's much more variability in that than in any, for example, a scientific process or something that is happening in nature. Because there, as soon as you involve decision making, and in both cases there's decision making. So, for example, why am I doing this modeling? To have fun? Yeah, okay, but that's not going to pay the bill, or that's not going to help anybody in the long run. So that I'm doing that modeling so that I can tell the decision maker, do this, don't do that. I'll give you an example. So in one of the projects, I was in New York for a couple of years before I moved to Peoria. And at that time, we had this project on the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. It's called, there are 2 ponds, 2 freshwater ponds. One is called the East Pond and the West Pond, right? So, and they are freshwater ponds. They were created back in the 1940s by an act from, I think, Mayor LaGuardia at that time. So basically, these 2 ponds, they were undergoing various kinds of issues going back to the 80s, and then they asked me to look at it in the late 1990s. So we did that, and then I did some of that work there, and then I brought some of it back here to Peoria. We did some modeling work on that. So when we did this analysis, so the question, the people on the ground there, they said, well, should we invest in something like an aeration system, or should we not invest in a aeration system? That was the question that they had, because that costs money. not only capital costs, but the operating costs are very high for that. So they wanted to have some sound science to make that decision. So we did a lot of different scenarios and ran it. And what we found was that if they actually instituted that solution of putting in the aeration, even though it sounds really nice and wonderful to put oxygen and air into the water, it would be detrimental because it would stir up the sediment so much, and the amount of BOD which was in there was so high that it would actually kill some of those for a long time. And so I think what we eventually came up with that's what our modeling told us. And so then we went we looked at it from a management standpoint, and then we said from a decision making standpoint, the better option for them is not to invest in the new technology, but rather to use their existing technology and manage how they're have some kind of protective barriers, etc. So from that standpoint, that was the decision that they came. So that was a science-based or a evidence-based decision that helped them to create their own policy, and then they may have used it elsewhere. So the same thing happened in Lake Alsur, and also there's another lake in Rajasthan that I had some work, but mostly the Lake Alsur also, which is in Bangalore, by the way, in India. That was also something like that.
Yeah, from a policy perspective, I guess there are multiple issues, right? One is the horizon problem for the decision maker. If the politician is involved in a decision-making process, he or she is trying to get elected, that is a horizon that they need to optimize. And the other thing is the externalization of costs. So when we think about costs, we are typically not thinking about societal costs, right? So, going back to the India case study, it is the entire cost on the system, such as diseases that emerge from lack of good water, all sorts of issues downstream that is not going it's going to show up in the long run. We don't really have a process for the environment, right, to make decisions that takes into account all possible costs, and we will end up always suboptimizing decisions.
Yeah, and that's a very complex thing. And we have in the area of sustainability, we have some work that's been done by different scientists, especially in University of South Florida. And for example, it's a different way of thinking. It's a systems thinking, and you probably use that a lot in the corporate world as well.
Yeah.
But with the systems thinking, you have to think about all the inputs and outputs. So you can do that. You can quantify some of these things. But when it comes to I can't really blame the politicians because they want to get elected, so okay. It's a reality. That's what it is. It doesn't matter which party they are and all that stuff, but whenever it comes to any environmental issues, etc., it's mostly local. So that way, we can that drives the policy also. But like what you said, when you look at the policy making process itself, especially when you're looking at the environmental side of it, you have so many entities involved, and you have to look at it also from whether it's at the federal level, whether it's at the state level, or the local level.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of stakeholders, So when we have these stakeholders, such as the people, regulators like EPA, etc., and typically I have some friends in the industry. And sometimes they tell me all the different things that happen. So typically, when a policy comes out, it's published in this register, federal register. It comes out, and then it may be challenged. The people look at it very carefully and see if their industry is challenged, etc. And then they may approach their politicians, etc., to change it. And that's a continuous process that happens after a few cycles, and all of those hearings, eventually it gets published and becomes maybe some kind of a regulation. So we're looking at something starting as a law, going into the policy, and then eventually into unless it comes to the regulation, it's not going to really mean much, because the policy may be something, but the regulation is where you can say that the
you cannot do something bad.
So unless the regulation is there,
yeah,
that's where I guess the rubber meets the road type of thing. That's where the real thing happens. So policy has to be evidence-based. That is the number one thing that we want to think about, or have in mind. The second thing is that you have to consider the realities of the politics and which are there, but that has to take a secondary place to what we are looking at. So, I mean, and that is also a problem in any society, in any country in today's world. But, we have to take the long-term view. And we are always used to taking the short-term view because, somebody's worried about their election, or some company is worried about their next quarter earnings, etc. It's always like that. So, but the people who look at the long-term, goal, whether it happens to be in a company or whether it happens to be in a larger economic, environmental issue like this, those are the people who come out ahead because they are well prepared for, dealing with those eventualities. But it requires a certain vision, and it requires that, the systems thinking to get there.
Yeah. Now I want to talk about something completely different, Krishnan. So this is. You've been working with a non-profit organization. I believe it's founded by Dr. Madhu Vishwanathan, one of your colleagues, and it's called MarketPlaceLiteracy. And this is in India?
Right. Yeah, it started in India. So one of the things I found in life is that I have some very fantastic friends, and I choose to, and these are the people also that I love to work with in different capacities. So Madhu Vishwanathan is also one of them. Madhu Vishwanathan actually was a classmate of mine while we were both in IIT Madras.
Yeah.
And you may remember him also. I'm not sure, but he's a professor. He's now moved to Loyola in California after retiring from University of Illinois Champaign after almost 30 years. He was working in the area of subsistence marketing, and he had this vision to found this organization called MarketPlaceLiteracy. And the idea was that we wanted the goal was to empower people with knowledge, and at a very small scale. And when you empower people with knowledge and how to do certain things, especially in terms of how to run a business, how to create a small business, etc. And you're talking about cottages, those that level in villages. And this time when I went to India, I had a chance to go and visit some of the villages, and I had a lot of discussions with the people involved. And even in my broken Tamil, because I'd forgotten it from the time I had lived in Chennai, it was a really eye-opening experience in terms of how they're able to use the principles of marketing and how they're able to adapt that to actually creating extremely small businesses with a very, very small, profit margin, but they still are able to do it. Now, it's especially important in some of the villages, and it was important in South India. That's where it started, and mostly in Tamil Nadu, and then it grew into other states as well. But the problem was that the women in many of these villages, they really had a lack of resources. In other words, they didn't have money to run their household also. So for people like them, this was like a boon. So they would actually show up in larger numbers. And there's a team that Madhu built over a period of time. It took a lot of hard work, a lot of his own money, and along the way we helped in different ways. But he built a huge team, and it became a big success there. And right now it's actually going on actively there in India. But it also has gone. Now there are, and then later on he became active in Africa, Kenya, and other places. and then also in South America. So now, the whole organization is in about 13 different countries, and it's all, it's amazing thing is that it's mostly volunteer driven, and part of the reason why this works is just like the case of that the Indian example with having the buy-in from the local people in terms of them seeing the value in, for example, treating the water for economic benefit, or their farming, or to create, say, fish, etc. So the same way, to grow fish and then have a economy which supported that.
Yeah.
The same idea was here, that they saw the impact of this, how they could change it. And so even though the focus of this is educational, the way that it spread and it impacted people is quite large. So that is a very, very beautiful project that
it sounds really exciting, Krishna. So, two things. There was a big push toward microfinancing, right? Which is, you don't need a lot of money to get somebody self-sustaining. It takes very little money, but they have to have access at the right time. And this is sort of, which is, there is some basic literacy, experience, expertise needed to set something up and make it self-sustaining. And if you can provide these two aspects, right, the micro expertise, just call it, and microfinancing, then you can actually create a very self-sustaining system with people doing their own, applying their own energy to the problem.
No, you're absolutely right with that. So, the financing part is that you can say microfinancing, that would be a very effective way. But yeah, this marketplace literacy is more on the literacy side.
Okay.
We said that was on the, there are two aspects to it. One is to gain access to the money, which is one thing. And because, then you need to be a bank, or you need to have relationships. But here it was more in terms of educating the people, in terms of teaching them what works, what doesn't work, not coming in and telling them what to do, but actually looking at what the situation is and then adapting the principles of subsistence marketplace to actually, make it work for them. And, it is amazing that when I went and met some of these women, and it was amazing that, when I went there, most of the people there were women. You had groups of, and it is so nice to see that, because, many of them told me that we had some meetings also in Chennai and also in the rural areas. But one of the things that stuck with me was how empowered they felt by just having enough money so that they didn't have to ask their mother-in-law or father-in-law or their husband, that they could do something on their own. And for somebody to feel independent and have that freedom, it is just, priceless. So, that's really a fantastic thing, in terms of, say, the contribution of this. But, and remember, since it's a small enough, operation, not operation in terms of the number of people involved, but in terms of how much work they needed to do, but they needed to do things. They needed to learn things. They needed to go in a methodical way. So there were workshops organized, and this was not just once in a, one here and one there. It was a systematic process where the team on the ground would meet with them, get them going, give them all the tools, and they would work through all the difficulties that they had financially and also from a family standpoint that they may sometimes. When you're looking at villages, they may not be able to attend all the meetings because of various types of, social issues and also what might be happening at home, etc.
Right.
But in spite of that, it took root, and it was so rewarding to actually see so many women, and you have young people, you have older people, and they just had nothing but gratitude for this program, which actually empowered them with education, with knowledge. So that's why, I think in India we have such a high regard for knowledge that that just tells you that this really works. I mean, you teach somebody something that stays with them.
Yeah, yeah. So in conclusion, Krishna, so if you go back to sort of the environment degradation related to waste, we can see that problem not only in developing countries but all around the world. And you have done a lot of work in this area. So you look forward 5 years, let's say. Where do you think we will be? Are things improving, or are we, going down a path that we can really turn back from?
Yeah, I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
So I mean, I can see the good, but it would be foolish to not recognize that we are faced with pretty big challenges. Now, I just talked about water, right? But there are other issues that we're dealing with. Things like how the climate is changing, et cetera. These are huge, major problems. And, the interesting and a good thing is that we have it in our own power to change the way that we do things. And the quicker we do them, or the quicker we realize them and actually know in our hearts that that's the right thing to do,
Yeah,
the faster will be the change that will be needed, so that we can pass it on to the generations that come around us. There's a very famous quotation that we don't inherit the earth, but we really borrow it from our future generations.
Yeah.
So it's a question of having that type of an attitude. And one of my teachers, one of my spiritual teachers, he says very beautifully that everybody is born a consumer, in the sense that when you grow up, as soon as you're born, you need something. But then
yeah,
when you start to become a contributor, you change from being a consumer to being a contributor, become a blessing to the world. And I think everybody has that power to actually become a contributor.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. Krishna, this has been great. It has been great to catch up after 35 years.
Yeah,
And
I can't believe it.
yeah, thanks for spending time with me, and good luck with everything that you're doing in this area.
It's wonderful to talk to you, Gill, and hope to talk to you again soon. And I know you're somewhere on the East Coast at this moment, or
I am, yeah, I'm
okay,
in New York area, yeah.
So so hopefully we'll be able to connect pretty soon.
Sounds good. Okay. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.